In the spring of 1923, workers renovating St. Michael's Cemetery in Charleston, South Carolina made a discovery so disturbing that city officials ordered it sealed from public record within 24 hours. 9 coffins, 9 men, all buried between 1851 and 1855, all from Charleston's most prominent families. And inside every single coffin, the wooden lids bore deep scratch marks from human fingernails. The bodies inside lay in positions that no peacefully deceased person ever lay in, twisted, contorted, the positions of men who had fought with everything they had against an enclosed space and lost. The men had been buried alive. City officials classified the discovery as sensitive historical material. The records were sealed. The families were never officially notified, and the story might have disappeared entirely into Charleston's carefully maintained silence if not for something else the workers found that same day. Buried beneath the cemetery's oldest magnolia tree, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather journal. The name on the inside cover was Solomon Fairfax. To understand what Solomon Fairfax did and why 9 of Charleston's most respected citizens ended their lives clawing at the lids of their own coffins, you have to go back to the morning of March 14th, 1851, to a slave auction on Charleston's waterfront, to a man who spent that morning memorizing faces. Solomon Fairfax was not an ordinary man by any measure the world around him used. He had been born into slavery on the Pemberton Plantation 15 miles outside Charleston, the son of a woman named Ruth who had been the plantation's healer for 30 years before him. From childhood, Solomon had absorbed her knowledge with the precision of someone who understood, without being told, that knowledge was the only form of property that could not be legally taken from him. He learned the medicinal properties of every plant that grew in the Carolina Lowcountry. He learned to prepare compounds that ease fever, stop bleeding, reduce inflammation, and in the right doses, could be the difference between life and death of people around him. By the time he was 30, Solomon Fairfax was the most skilled healer on the Pemberton Plantation. He had saved lives that trained physicians had given up on. He had developed treatments for conditions that the white doctors who occasionally visited the plantation could not explain. Edmund Pemberton, the plantation owner, recognized Solomon's value with the cold clarity of a man who understood assets. He allowed Solomon to marry a woman named Celia. He allowed them to raise their 3 children, 8-year-old Marcus, 6-year-old Samuel, and 4-year-old Grace, in one of the plantation's slave quarters. He allowed this arrangement because Solomon's healing skills kept the plantation's workforce alive and productive, and the arrangement cost him nothing. Until March of 1851, when Edmund Pemberton's gambling debts came due. The sale was announced on a Tuesday. By Friday, Solomon's wife and 3 children were listed in an auction catalog alongside 6 other families whose primary value to Edmund Pemberton at that moment was the price they could command at the Charleston waterfront. Solomon did everything a man in his position could do. He pleaded. He offered to work additional years without compensation. He suggested arrangements by which he might earn the money himself. Pemberton listened to none of it. The arithmetic of his debts was simple, and the auction date was fixed. The morning of March 14th, Solomon stood in chains on the Charleston waterfront and watched his family sold, not together, separately, to maximize the individual prices. Marcus to a rice planter from Georgetown, Samuel to a cotton farmer whose reputation for working people to death was known throughout the region, Grace, 4 years old, to a family in Savannah as a house servant. He memorized every face in that crowd, every man who bid, every man who laughed, every man who stood and watched with a comfortable detachment of someone observing a transaction that had nothing to do with him. He memorized 9 faces in particular. That same afternoon, Dr. Cornelius Hathaway purchased Solomon for his medical practice on Meeting Street, paying a premium price that reflected Solomon's exceptional reputation as a healer. As Solomon was led away from the waterfront to begin his new life, he wrote the first entry in a leather journal he had managed to keep hidden through the entire ordeal. Today I watched my family destroyed, and I did nothing to stop it. But I am still alive, and I remember every face, every name, every voice that laughed while my world ended. They think they have broken me. They have only taught me patience. Drop a comment below and tell us where you are watching from. Subscribe and hit the bell if you are new here, Because what Solomon Fairfax did with that patience over the next 4 years is one of the most extraordinary and terrible stories in the history of American slavery. And we are only at the beginning. Dr. Cornelius Hathaway's medical practice on Meeting Street was, without Solomon Fairfax intending it, the perfect instrument of revenge. The doctor was a widower in his 50s, increasingly limited by arthritis that made precise work difficult, and deeply dependent on Solomon's steady hands and encyclopedic knowledge of medicinal compounds. Charleston's wealthy elite visited the practice regularly, men with gout, with weak hearts, with the chronic conditions that accompanied prosperous sedentary lives. They came monthly, sometimes weekly. They trusted Dr. Hathaway completely, and they became entirely comfortable with Solomon's presence, often requesting him specifically for his gentle manner and his obvious competence. Solomon served them all with the same quiet professionalism. He prepared their medications. He monitored their conditions. He asked about their families with the respectful interest of a man who understood his place. And while he did all of this, he listened, he observed, he cataloged everything, what he was building. In the 18 months following his arrival at the practice was a complete intelligence portrait of the 9 men he had identified on the Charleston waterfront. Through careful listening in the treatment rooms, through discreet conversations with other enslaved people who worked in the grand houses along the Battery, through the invisible network of information that moved through Charleston's slave community with a speed and accuracy that the white population never suspected, Solomon assembled detailed profiles of each man, their medical conditions, their treatment schedules, their routines, their weaknesses, and most importantly, their specific involvement in the auction that had destroyed his family. Some had been bidders. Some had been financial backers of the slave trading operation. Some had simply laughed. Solomon did not consider laughter a minor offense. The chemistry came from Dr. Hathaway's own library. Among the medical texts that lined the office shelves was a treatise on South American plant toxins that described a compound derived from a specific vine, cultivated successfully in the greenhouse of a Charleston botanist who supplied exotic specimens to wealthy collectors. The compound, when properly prepared and administered in the correct dose, would induce complete muscular paralysis while leaving the victim's consciousness entirely intact. The affected person would appear dead to any physician of the era. No detectable pulse, no visible breathing, but they would remain fully aware of everything happening around them for hours until the paralysis reached the organs that could not be paralyzed without ending life entirely. Solomon spent months acquiring the plant through Professor Nathaniel Crenshaw at the College of Charleston, a man delighted to find someone who shared his passion for exotic botany and entirely unaware of the use to which his specimens would be put. Solomon spent further months refining the compound through careful experimentation, testing dosages with the same methodical precision he brought to all his medical work. Too little produced temporary weakness. Too much produced immediate death. The correct amount produced something in between, a state indistinguishable from death to physicians of 1852, while preserving the victim's awareness through the hours that followed their apparent passing. Through their burial, his first target was Colonel Reginald Fitzpatrick, a wealthy rice planter who had not merely attended the auction, but had laughed loudly at the children being offered for sale, making jokes about their value as future breeding stock. Fitzpatrick visited Dr. Hathaway monthly for gout treatment. He was arrogant, predictable, and lived alone except for house slaves who were terrified of him. He was ideal. On December 15th, 1852, Dr. Hathaway was occupied with another patient when Fitzpatrick arrived for his regular appointment. Solomon prepared the colonel's medication and added to it precisely measured drops of his compound. Fitzpatrick consumed it without question. He had been receiving treatments from Solomon for months and had no reason to hesitate. As the paralysis began its work, Solomon sat beside the colonel's chair and spoke in the same calm professional tone he used with all his patients. "Colonel Fitzpatrick, my name is Solomon Fairfax. You were at the slave auction on March 14th, 1851. You laughed when my children were sold. Do you remember that day?" Fitzpatrick's eyes showed recognition, then horror, then the desperate comprehension of a man who understood exactly what was happening and could do absolutely nothing about it. His voice was already gone. His body was already still. Solomon continued, "You are not dead yet. The compound I gave you has paralyzed every muscle in your body, but your mind is completely clear. Dr. Hathaway will examine you shortly and pronounce you dead from heart failure. Tomorrow evening you will be placed in your coffin and buried in St. Michael's Cemetery. But you will not actually die until several hours after you are buried. You will be completely aware as the dirt is shoveled onto your coffin. You will have a great deal of time to think about what you did to my children. That is when you will understand what terror truly feels like. When Dr. Hathaway entered the treatment room minutes later, he found Solomon standing respectfully beside what appeared to be Colonel Fitzpatrick's body, his expression showing appropriate concern and sadness. The doctor's examination confirmed the obvious: heart failure. Given the colonel's known cardiac condition, no further investigation was warranted. That evening, Solomon made the second entry in his journal. Colonel Fitzpatrick has paid for his crimes. 8 more remain. Justice is patient, but it is also certain. The months following Colonel Fitzpatrick's burial passed without incident. Charleston social circles observed the expected period of mourning for a prominent citizen and moved on. Dr. Hathaway mentioned the case to colleagues as an example of how quickly cardiac failure could claim even seemingly healthy men. Solomon's reputation as a skilled and compassionate medical assistant remained entirely untarnished. He had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and no one had noticed. His second target was Judge Marcus Calverton, a man whose crimes against Solomon's family were of a different and in some ways worse category. Calverton had not merely attended the auction. He had spent years providing legal justification for the separation of slave families, arguing in court that such practices were economically necessary and legally sound. He had constructed the intellectual framework that allowed men like Edmund Pemberton to destroy families with a clear conscience and a clean legal record. He visited the practice for severe migraines that had worsened significantly over 2 years. Solomon administered his compound to Judge Calverton in April 1853, but made his first serious error. A slightly elevated dose produced paralysis more rapidly and completely than intended. Dr. Hathaway, conducting an examination, paused over the body with an expression that made Solomon's heart stop. Strange. The muscle rigidity is more pronounced than typical for stroke victims. And look at his eyes. There is something almost desperate about their expression. Solomon stood completely still while the doctor conducted a more thorough examination than he had performed on Fitzpatrick. For 15 minutes, Solomon waited, his face showing nothing, while Dr. Hathaway worked through a medical analysis that came terrifyingly close to the truth without quite reaching it. Finally, the doctor concluded that the unusual symptoms were simply the result of a particularly severe stroke. Poor man must have suffered terribly in his final moments, Dr. Hathaway observed, describing with perfect accuracy exactly what Judge Calverton was experiencing at that very moment. At Calverton's funeral, Solomon noticed something that changed his calculations entirely. A young man standing at the back of the crowd, taking careful notes in a small leather book. His name was Thomas Grimby. He wrote for the Charleston Mercury, and he had begun investigating what he privately called the prominent death phenomenon, a series of sudden fatalities among Charleston's elite that were individually explainable but collectively suspicious. Solomon's journal entry that evening reflected his new reality. I fear that others are beginning to notice patterns that could threaten the completion of my mission. I must work faster, even if it means accepting greater risks. The acceleration of his timeline created a new problem. His third target, Captain William Dandridge, a ship owner who had personally supervised the loading of human cargo for transport throughout the South, did not visit the practice regularly. Solomon would need to create an opportunity. Rather than wait for one, he created it through the network. Kitchen slaves who worked in the grand houses along the Battery shared information with a speed and completeness that their employers never suspected. Through these connections, Solomon learned that Captain Dandridge was hosting a dinner party on May 20th, 1853, for 12 of Charleston's most influential shipping merchants. He arranged, through an elderly woman named Martha, who supervised kitchen operations for many of Charleston's social events, to serve at the dinner. The evening was everything Solomon had hoped for and everything he had feared. Moving through the dining room with practiced invisibility, he listened to conversations that stripped away any remaining doubt about the men around him. They discuss human beings with the same detached interest they showed for cotton prices or shipping schedules. They calculated the profitability of transport routes with the same language they use for livestock. Captain Dandridge held court at the head of the table, entertaining his guests with detailed techniques for preventing rebellions during the transport of human cargo. Solomon administered his compound to the captain's brandy-soaked dessert during the serving of the final course. What he had not planned for was the speed of the effect. Instead of retiring quietly and being discovered the following morning, Captain Dandridge excused himself from the table and collapsed in his private study in front of 12 witnesses, who immediately began demanding explanations. One of the dinner guests, a physician named Dr. Pettigrew, examined the body and announced to the assembled company that the muscle rigidity was quite pronounced and that it almost appeared the captain had been poisoned. The word poison spread through Charleston social circles before dawn. Within hours, Thomas Grimby had connected Solomon's presence at the dinner party to the previous deaths. The net was closing. Solomon had 3 intended victims dead and 6 remaining. The investigation that would eventually reach him had already begun. His response was not caution. It was acceleration.